this podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Patreon is a monthly subscription that you can cancel anytime, and PayPal is a one-time donation. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, the handle, the Beirut Banyan. And you can find us on our YouTube channel with the same name, and you can start watching the episodes as they're released. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan. I'm going to start by saying thank you for staying up past 10 p.m. in Beirut. You should be asleep or at best just surfing Instagram, Twitter, whatever. I guess TikTok is the new thing. Instead, you're stuck with me,
right,
talking about heavy things. And what a way to go to bed, right? Dealing with the existential problems of Lebanon. I literally reached out to you 24 hours ago about a particular issue I want to get to the bottom of. And it's the old way of power sharing, the sectarian structure that we both know a bit too well. And I'd love to play devil's advocate when appropriate. And there's also another issue that No, it's my pleasure. And there's another subject that I know very little about, and I'm hoping to gauge your mind on. And that's it's really, I guess, communities beyond the traditional power sharing structure we're familiar with. And that could be discriminated groups, that can be many different types of communities that just don't fall under the traditional power sharing structure. And in this case, it's the LGBTQ community, in particular during the protest movement. Something I'm interested in, and I know that you helped contribute to, and there's a paper I'd like to explore. Mana, let me just start by asking you, the hyperinflation that we're getting used to, unfortunately, these sort of very stark images of not just lines for bread, not just dark streets at night, but literal pain. Suicides last week, hospitals unable to deliver surgeries, many things that are reaching a tipping point. I'm not in Beirut. I'm watching this from afar, but I'm curious your own immediate life right now, given all that's happening. Has it changed much? Is there anything that's impacting you personally? Just maybe your own reaction to that.
Ever since the revolution, actually, I have felt anxiety, to say the least, over my future here and the future of people who are like me. Not necessarily like me, but just people my age. During Corona, and especially during the hyperinflation period, I'm working. I work, so I'm not as affected, right? But that doesn't really. I do live in a bubble because I work. I still eat out and everything, but this doesn't really. This isn't really an excuse for me to say that, oh no, Lebanon is fine and we will get over it soon. It's very hard for me to live properly and normally, because in the back of my head, all I see, my eyes are only exposed to people on the streets, homeless people. Even in Hamra now, there's homeless people living and sleeping on the streets. And so it hasn't been the best time living here, especially for somebody who I'd say I care a lot for my society, and just seeing it fall apart like this is a bit. It's not the best thing to feel, and it's not the best thing to see. But if I can help one person, then I'm content,
I think diplomacy might be your trade, because that's probably the most well packaged display of how how bad things are, and you're able to kind of caress it a bit, which I think is good.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that your individual life seems to be okay given how bad things are.
Yeah.
But in terms of work, are you still able to rely on a regular income, or incomes being delayed? And just in terms of inflation, I mean, just I guess the mechanism of trying to go to work and working, I'm assuming, for income.
The routine of going to work is a bit absurd to me. It was absurd to me. It was absurd to me during the revolution days. I used to. It was absurd because like things were falling apart, but like I had to think of the project that I was working on, and I had to think of my studies, and so I was living a double life. If I may say, but like in terms of income, no, and I can rely on my income in a stable way. Like I'm not affected, but and this does create a sort of guilt, if I can say. Like I am so aware of the fact that I'm privileged. It kind of creates this feeling of guilt that, oh, I'm not as anxious as somebody who's my age, who has the same potential, who has the same capabilities, who should have had the same opportunities as me. But I can feel the inequality, and I can feel the just the state of unfairness, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely.
And so it's not the best feeling. Yeah, it's not the best feeling.
Before we started recording, you asked me a very simple question, like, how are you doing? Or something to that effect. And I didn't want to even acknowledge any inconvenience, given, I think, what you're saying, which is it's relative. And I think a lot of us are just sort of are cautious, maybe. And I'm glad you acknowledged that that in a way I think I got this right, that you may not be around much longer anyway, despite what's happening, that your intention is to leave. Is that part of it, that you see kind of you see there's an exit in a sense, that you're not going to be sticking around much longer, that in a way you can kind of avoid the maybe the more pain that's to come?
I do think about leaving every day, to be honest.
Okay, so it's worse than I expected.
I'm being very honest.
No, that's yeah.
But I do acknowledge that it's hard to leave. And this is due to the other obstacles that I face as a Lebanese trying to leave. Not just for studies, but just to leave in general permanently. It is hard to leave in terms of paperwork, and also like now with the banks not giving us our money abroad. So like leaving abroad right now is difficult. I would rather stay here with my family, with my friends. I was talking about this with a friend, and she was like, would you leave your friends and family behind if you had the opportunity right now to leave? And I thought about it twice, and I was like, selfishly, I would leave, but that would make me a selfish person, and I don't think I want that. So I was like, no, I would rather stay, but eventually leaving for a while maybe is healthy, and it's like, why not, if that makes sense.
No, of course. The reason I'm asking you these fairly personal questions, which I don't usually ask, I just wanted to explore a sort of younger generation's immediate concerns, and somebody that in a way I can relate to, that I felt the same way before in different chapters of recent history. What you're going through right now reminds me of decisions I had to make during the 2006 war. That it's right. And I know that this is not a violent episode per se. I know that there's no bombs falling. There's no sort of there are no fighter jets, and there's no siege, and so it's a very different context. But that kind of there's a breakdown, and the airport was closed, and then it reopened, and many people sort of tried to leave during the war, and those that couldn't, many left after the fighting ended. And it kind of just harkens back to that challenge of sticking around, trying to help and be close maybe to loved ones, but more than that, sort of seeing something that you need to, it's like almost like a commitment to where you're from, or unable to deliver, and therefore search for work abroad or search for life abroad. And you know what, I ended up going back and forth so many times that I never found the answer. And maybe there is no answer at the end of the day. But I'm pushing on this issue because I'm curious about, it's really what you've been writing in these LSE blogs, and this is how I discovered you.
Yeah.
And there's one blog post, it's a little dated, it's from October 2019, but I think it's dated only in terms of how many months have passed. It's that sort of the core of the problem. What is taking you abroad, and what took me abroad, and in a sense what took my parents abroad, and what took generations abroad. Now, so it's a big subject, but I'm just going to introduce the blog post. It's Breaking the Sectarian Chains, Lebanon Revolts Against Its Corrupt Leaders. And it's a blog post you co-wrote, and I'm just going to read one sort of section of it, and we can kind of dissect it. And this is the part where you can start screaming at me and punching and sort of like, get the knife out and say, "Where do you live?" It's like, haha, I'm not there. So I'll just introduce the main theme of the post. So despite the catalyst moment, referring to the protests that have been ongoing, structured obstacles should be highlighted. The ossified regime, reliant as it is upon sectarianism, is deeply embedded in the Lebanese political system. Its practices reproduce sectarian identities. So this is just an introduction.
Yes.
I want to challenge, no, I'm going to start using a different word. I'm going to gauge your mind first.
Okay.
The word sectarianism.
Yes.
I think automatically, and you probably see it the same way, it's a pejorative word. There's almost like it's hard to see any comfort in that word, sectarianism. So just if you could maybe offer just a brief description of what sectarianism means to you in the Lebanese context. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm just curious, because I know that word is something negative.
Right.
And I want to know what exactly it means to you.
Yeah. A lot of scholars link sectarianism to identity, but sectarianism is beyond identity. It's related to politics, it's related to economics, it's related to culture, and by culture I mean who do we include in the system, who do we exclude from the system. And here comes the famous let's divide the parliamentary seats between Christians and Muslims, let's divide public administrations between Christians and Muslims. And this for me is very simplistic because it categorizes and reduces society into two I'd say fields or categories, which is not accurate. Our society is not just based on sects, it's more than that. It's based on, people with certain behavior, social classes, economic classes, gender. It's much more diverse than that. So for me, the system and its acknowledgement to only sects is an issue because it undermines so many problems we have. Because its raison d'etre is to protect the sects, protect the communities, protect the leaders even, and disregard all the structural problems we are currently facing as a society, whether it's employment, whether it's environmental problems, or any kinds of problems that are not related to me being affiliated to a certain community or a certain sect.
Right.
So this is what I mean by structural obstacles.
No, and I'm glad I'm asking this because I'll give one recent example. The Ministry of Energy and Water, that very fancy title for Kahraba Lebanon and Co. Yeah, that they released sort of, or I don't know if they released it. Maybe it was released by a newspaper. I don't remember the exact source, but it's a listing of the board members that were nominated recently. I think this was shared yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. And it's sort of this classic Maronite, Orthodox, Druze, Sunni, Shia, etc., etc. And so, like,
I was very angry when I read that. By the way,
right?
Yeah.
And I'm assuming you were angry because not because it's divided equally, but you're that's got you're right. So it's that the system that we live in discourages merit-based employment or all the above. But so that's an obvious sort of. That's an obvious issue. But that said, is sectarianism or the power sharing structure the issue that's preventing decent appointments based on merit? Is it actually the power sharing that prevents it, or is it a simple issue of the state has become so corrupt and so beyond reach in terms of public's ability to hold it to account, that its behavior is similar to any corrupt regime's behavior, that the religious power sharing may not be the core issue, and that's what I'm trying to delicately challenge the from a sort of a humble I'm not trying to so is it power sharing in its essence that's leading to corruption, or is corruption a byproduct of other issues and power sharing has kind of been thrown into the mix in terms of that's the problem?
Right. Well, political sectarianism in Lebanon it originates from different areas, right? You have the historical circumstances. You have the system of governance, which is consociational democracy or power sharing system, and you have the main, well, not the main component, but you also have colonialism, which we don't necessarily acknowledge. Rarely do we, because we're so blinded by the logic of our system, right, that we tend to forget that it's not an organic thing, to think about dividing seats between sects. It's a product of colonialism.
And sorry, just to interrupt, but when you say colonialism, are you referring to the French Mandate, or is it something prior to that?
Yes, the French mandate, and even the European intervention under the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, so it's really going back to Mutasarrifi and that sort of era. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. I mean, sectarianism was institutionalized after the 1860 massacre that happened in Mount Lebanon. It was institutionalized because the Europeans and the Ottoman Empire, they decided to create this council where every sect was represented. And this is where the consensus system started.
Right.
So it's our system structurally is not strong enough to maintain a power sharing system based off of religion or sects, because, well, first of all, because of its history. It was created by the French, and the French during their time here, they didn't really implement the right ways, or they didn't really transmit the right ways to actually do politics. So it's very cultural. They instead of teaching us, instead of trying to show us how they do democracy back home, what they did is that they divided and they ruled along sectarian lines. So you have the historical component that played a huge role, because after the creation of Lebanon, you had the bourgeoisie, the political bourgeoisie and the economic bourgeoisie that played a big role in how they saw Lebanon and how they took decisions based off of their, power positions.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have the consociational theory, which is based on elite governance. So when we talk about elite governance, we talk about a very inclusive governance, which does not include society, and it does not include the whole, the communities within your society, right? So this, on top of just the mere action of, not action, but just like holding power, there's something psychological about having so much power that some people take it for granted and they start to personalize it. For me, the issue in Lebanon is it's a mix of these three components. It's behavioral, the elite, the behavior of the elite, the agency of the state is embedded in a very personalistic understanding of politics. You also have the theory, which is our system, which is embedded in, this community cannot interact with the other community because we're so deeply divided that we need to actually communicate to our leader of community, which is the Za'im.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the one who should be coordinating and cooperating with the other Za'im so that we can live in a very peaceful and stable settings. This is not sustainable.
So, okay, I'm glad you actually, in a way, you've given me permission now to go explore a bit of our history, because you correctly referenced things that are prior to the French Mandate. You took us back to the 1860s, so now I can challenge you. There's a second point to the blog post. Clientelist relations are based on financial dependency, which restrains people from mobilizing against those who provide for them, in fear of being cut off from access to resources and services. Through these waves of protests, the people of Lebanon have finally proved their detachment from a corrupt, sectarian elite that has been occupying state institutions and initiating policies that benefit their own interests since 1989. So there's two things here. Is it an issue in terms of the structure itself, going back to the French, or is there a marker which you, in a way, you hint at, that it's the end of the Civil War and post 1989, this sort of post-war, very dysfunctional thing that we live with, and also that the access to resources and services. I'm just curious about the shinier years of modern Lebanese history. Those are far better years in terms of the public's relationship and maybe the state's responsibilities, that things worked to a point, and they don't work after 1989, but it's more or less the same type of government. It's not the exact same one, but it's one that's reliant on the structure that you describe. So I'm curious about that. Like, why is post 1989 so fundamentally different than the late 1940s, early 1950s?
I wouldn't say that the years before or prior to the Civil War they were better. I mean, there were a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but there were socioeconomic inequalities. The system was based on a certain social class. The system functioned on the economic bourgeoisie. It was not a coincidence that our economic sector was only based on tourism and banking. It's actually because, the economic elite, they worked in banking and tourism. And the fact that, the agricultural sector, the industrial sector, they were not developed during that times, it says a lot really about their own interest and wanting to gain more and wanting to appropriate and, state services basically, and a way to hold and a way to maintain their power. It was through um, communal loyalty, where I will give you this if you vote for me, or this.
Right.
I think
Yeah.
this is a pattern. This
Yeah.
is a historical pattern we're famous for. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the years prior to the Civil War they were better. I feel like they were the same, and they led to the Civil War. From a socio-economic point of view, the country wasn't working or wasn't as exclusive as it should have been, because its economy was based on on a very small social class.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I answered your
No,
question.
you did. But I'm
Okay.
okay. So avoiding the violence of the Civil War, avoiding and even what, even though it may be a point to reflect on, but let's say ignoring the history that happened those 15 years and focusing only on the structure itself, and
Right.
the fact that two things happened: the structure survived,
Right.
and the structure seems to be at odds with enough people today that there is a continuous protest movement that we're seeing on the streets, so that the structure is in desperate need of something, whether it's reform or sort of overhaul altogether. So that's clear that the relationship is so toxic today that people do not look at this model as a shining example. On the contrary, they'd rather either fundamentally fix it or alter it altogether. So that's clear.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious about whether or not the inherent consociational, confessional thing that Lebanon held on to, and you pointed at it earlier, the sort of consensus-driven, it still is, even today, that kind of a very slow, lethargic way of getting anything addressed. That if that is the source of corruption, and if we were to overhaul this thing, and let's say we ushered in something that a lot of us probably find far more appealing, that we'd still have the same corrupt people showing up, that the corruption may not be dismantled because sectarianism is dismantled, that we could also end up with a very bad secular form of governance. And then you sort of, I mean, and I know every country is a different sort of story, but the neighborhood doesn't offer much comfort in terms of its experiences with secular governance. That it's kind of gone through a very difficult chapter. It's not Ottoman, it's very 20th century and very brutal. And I mean, and I wouldn't blame secularism on those regimes' relationship and abuse towards their populations. I guess that's what I'm curious about. Is it really the type of governance, or is it other things that have made our outdated model so toxic?
I also think it's related somehow, because corruption is a product of a structure, right? And that structure is a product of power dynamics. That power dynamics was established, as we discussed earlier, through colonialism and through elite bourgeoisie dynamics. So secularism is obviously not going to be the answer to our problems.
Okay.
No, it won't. But we shouldn't exclude the idea of secularism, and this is another topic. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not sectarianism as because also when we talk about sectarianism is also the product of consociational democracy, because in order to keep intact the consociationalism that is the nature of our system, and the state needs to it needs to portray itself in a sectarian way, because consociational democracy, it functions on an understanding that puts forward one aspect of identity, quote unquote.
Right.
Which
right.
is right.
Yeah.
So instead of promoting, let's say, class struggles, or instead of like saying, oh, okay, so we're gonna divide the seats between two poor and two rich people, they're gonna say, no, this seat is gonna be for a Christian, and in order to mobilize the people, and in order to make them, to make them feel like I'm a part of this system, sectarianism comes in handy, because it mobilizes feelings, it mobilizes self-perception, it mobilizes how, not mobilizes, but it defines self-perception, and it also defines the way I see the other. And this is a very big problem in our society. It's the way we see ourselves as quote-unquote citizens of Lebanon, and it's the way we see others. And so corruption per se is deeper than just the system or the type of system that we might adopt, because as we've both agreed on, secularism is not going to solve the problem. Right. It's just the logic of how state-society relations are structured. They're not structured on a well-defined procedure that's impersonal, that's not linked to power dynamics, and that's fair and equal. No, it's based on who's more loyal to the regime, who's more loyal to the sectarian discourse, who's more loyal to the idea of being as embedded in the system as one can be. If that makes sense.
No, many conversations I've had that touch on this in different ways. I fully agree that it can't be just secularism versus sectarianism that would lead to fundamental change, that it goes beyond that. So I'm glad you pointed out that there are other issues, and also that it's almost entertaining thought that a quota system based on economic class, that's so unthinkable. But then, it should be as thinkable or as absurd as a confessional quota system.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you point out that it's a system that focuses on certain identification markers of minorities, but it's not every minority, and it's not maybe the healthiest way of identification. Mm-hmm. So no, that's a good way of. Well, you win. No, I'm kidding.
Yes.
Yeah, you just have a little emoticon,
Yeah.
No, and it's good. I mean, because I'm going to consider you an academic here, as somebody who's studying this subject and wants to pursue this in different ways. That it's nice to also have that bridge between that stuffy academic approach and then literally the youth's discontent with the current model. And I think that's also implies at the end of the day that reform is needed. Revolution aside, ambitions aside, and whatever desires aside, it's time that this model is reformed. And in a way, this is kind of a nice segue to the other piece that I wanted to touch on, which is the, and I hope I say this right, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, or Stiftung.
I just say FES, honestly.
FES! That German NGO that's always been around.
Yeah. Yep.
And in a way, it touches on two things. It touches on groups that don't fit in to the model.
Yeah.
And also maybe the positives of the protest movement, and perhaps also the persisting challenges that any protest movement can't solve, that this is so embedded and so deep in Lebanese society. So I'm going to get your opinion on this. I'll just introduce the piece. It's Between Pandemics and Social Violence in Lebanon, and I think the working title is Queers in Quarantine. So in terms of enunciation, I mean, I'm a fan of enunciation. You found it. Queers in quarantine. The only like
I need to give credits to Zena for this. Actually, she came
she
up with
did
the
it.
title.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
she did.
talk about
She's the creative one.
that. That's it. I mean, the subject aside, a good title.
Thanks.
I'll make sure she. I hope she hears this conversation, so she'll get acknowledgement for the title.
Yes, yes.
I'd like to assume it's just the title that she did. You did everything else.
No.
But no, that's not true. Okay, so I'll just one particular point, and I'll read it out loud.
Right.
Lebanon's political system of governance, consociational democracy, is embedded entirely in a corporate understanding that fixes, predetermines, and defines practices and orders exclusively through confessionalism.
Right.
Therefore, in such a power-sharing equation, the classification of fixed sect-based identities consequently omits multiple non-sect-based minorities, such as sexual minorities. And sectarian subjects don't have individual rights, as the state guarantees and only maintains communal rights, especially since it governs personal relations by different personal status laws. Is this the core of the issue in any group's relationship to the Lebanese model, that it's ignoring the individual, that it's focusing on the group? So is that the main problem here? That individual rights are not appreciated the way maybe you would want them, and they are handled in different cases? Or is it something more than that?
The problem is both on an institutional and societal level, at least the way I see it. So institutionally, there is an absence of diversity, which is pretty ironic because our state promotes diversity and it promotes that it includes everyone, but it doesn't really include the whole society, whether it's sexual minorities or women,
right?
Even
right, yeah,
right, or like any other types of communities that might exist within Lebanon. And this affects the way they produce policies. It affects the way they deal with communities and they deal with society. And we also have the societal component, which is we as a society, because sectarianism is very much embedded in our space, whether it's the way we move around, whether it's going to a certain place or like trying to take this road or this street, or just our basic social communication is it's hard for us to include, or it's hard for us to think and acknowledge that there are other people who are there. They might be Muslim, they might be Christian, but they're more than just Muslim and Christian.
Yeah.
And that they would like to live accordingly and not just under the label that is imposed on us by the state.
Yeah.
So the problem is structural. It's institutionally embedded, and it's also socially embedded.
Okay, well let's kind of, I'm going to try to link them up together. I'm going to start with the structure, and there's another quote to the piece. Bodies whose existence threaten this system are then naturally reduced to a taboo subject by sectarian, political, and religious leaders who use Arab and religious normative culture to justify gender oppression. In that sentence, there are three things lining up, and I think it's the whole operating system of Lebanon. It's the confessional power-sharing entity. It's the power, if you will, the authority of certain individuals and certain groups within the country, political power. And then it's the religious institutions. All three working against, by default, maybe not even willingly, it's almost like it's a default position, at not allowing that kind of expression. Am I getting this right? That even that in its essence, a sectarian system by default should be able to tolerate this kind of expression, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't
Mm-hmm.
because it cannot cope with groups that exist beyond the structure itself.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay? So I got that right. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's no hope in that case for real, true expression in the Lebanese model.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so
No.
that's stumbling blocks to the regime.
Yeah.
What then? Let's go to the society.
Right.
Is there an eagerness, or from your sort of side, do you see an eagerness in terms of holding that authority to account and saying no, they deserve their rights?
I think the state reflects society and vice versa. When the state, comes and say, and not, it doesn't even say when it just disregards and ignores, the livelihood of other minorities that are not necessarily sector related. It is a reflection of how our society is structured. Now, to say that there aren't people who are holding the state accountable, I'd be lying and I'd be disregarding the whole revolution that happened.
Right.
But أكيد يعني there's obviously people who are content with the system and with the identity that it promotes, because they find comfort, they find security, and they find, more importantly, security. And security is a very big component of our support to the system.
Yeah.
And here, political economy comes into the scene, and clientelism. It's a whole game of manipulation and providing informal services in order to secure this person or this family so that they can feel a sort of dependency or a sort of feeling of comfort that this leader is providing for me. So going back to your question, I think that it's very interrelated, and that the state is a depiction of our society and vice versa. So, which makes it more structural. But
right, but then where does the pressure go exactly in that sense? Because if they're reflecting each other,
right,
is there any maybe credence to the argument that you mentioned it later in the piece, that they are not visible, that they remain kind of in the shadows for a large part, that it's society itself that has to, in a way, change the way it looks at this group as much as the regime has to accommodate, that it's almost like both have to happen for there to be structural change?
I believe in that theory, I believe in that logic, which maybe might not make sense to others, but for me it kind of makes sense, because it's hard for me to envision the state taking the initiative to represent, to appoint women
right,
or so unfortunately it's hard for me to envision that, but and this is where society comes into has a big role in doing so. If society does not mobilize, because at the end of the day, and it might be very simplistic, or maybe the way I'm putting it, it's the society that sustains the state. If we want to talk, if we want to simplify it, so if the state sees that there's a counter argument or counter discourse of what it promotes, then maybe it will start, doing something else, or maybe it will start adopting a different approach to other minorities. But that is also kind of ideal, because they have lots of ways and tactics to get us on board with them, us as a society, I mean. But also maybe my perspective might be quite pessimistic and simplistic as well. What do I know? But maybe that's just how I see it.
No, but I'm glad. I mean, these are things that resonate. That society sustains the state, and that actually that helps explain why this model hasn't been forced out.
Right?
And
Yeah.
I mean, it is a lot more embedded, I think, than we appreciate. It's not just a bunch of crooked people holding on to authority. It's far deeper than that.
Yeah.
And probably not for the. I mean, at the cost of improving Lebanon, it kind of
Yeah.
keeps Lebanon stunted, to a sense.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to wrap it up with another quote from this piece, and it's something that I saw in the streets of Beirut in late last year. The October Revolution has allowed the LGBTQ community to organically reclaim some public space without having to worry about the consequent oppression they usually face for public existence. And I'll just skim down a bit further. The revolution was viewed by many as the only chance to change the status quo as radically as possible. However, with lockdown restrictions that were imposed to keep everyone safe, much of the LGBTQ community retreated from the streets as they faced multi-layered difficulties that put both their safety and livelihood at risk. And then in between that, you point at the shift from the 2005 You Stink protests, where it wasn't so accommodating for any type of disenfranchised group per se. It was accommodating to a point, and that by 2019, it's sort of welcoming refugees, LGBTQ community, domestic workers. I mean, sort of everyone that you would not see visible, they became the driving force. I'm getting two things from you, though, on that sort of that segment. That this might be the first time the public is pushing for reform.
Right.
And that's societal reform. That's not necessarily state reform. That the public is trying to change their perceptions of disenfranchised groups. And more recently, you've seen push for the kafala system to be thrown away altogether.
Right.
And then at the same time, there's not much reform happening.
Right.
So I'm just going to get your opinion on where you see things moving. You have this push, and it may not be far enough. It may only be in its sort of starting phase, but it's there. There's something happening. And then you have the model, the old model that is as entrenched today as it was in October last year. That it's entrenched even with the blackouts. It's entrenched with hyperinflation. It's entrenched with everything that we see happening, and it's still there. It hasn't been overthrown.
Yeah.
So I'm curious: is it up to society to maybe push harder, and then its relationship to the state will change, and the state will change as a result? Does it start from the bottom? Is it a grassroots, if you will, a grassroots revolution that it takes time, or should people expect more now, and maybe in a way, the regime is fighting, and it may win at the end of the day? I'm curious your perspective on what we're seeing in a way happening live on the streets.
Right. Well, this is something I think about constantly. Funny enough, and it's a dilemma that I face. Do we, as people who want change, do we go, or do we cooperate with the state so that we can change it, or are we supposed to take a very radical position against it and try to protest and organize ourselves so that we can at one point overthrow it? But again, how do we overthrow it? Nobody knows.
Do we overthrow ourselves? I mean,
yeah, I don't know. So it is something that I don't have a proper answer to, but the protests that happened, they kind of they did put a lot of things into perspective, at least, because I did see that no, society is not black and it's not either black or white.
Yeah.
State is not also black and white. And the fact that, yes, people on the streets, they were very welcoming, but, you know, they were in a certain in a very revolutionary space. We tend to forget about the normal, or the, I'd say, your normal self. I don't know if I'm making sense, but what I'm trying to say is that it's very hard for me to see, even though I do believe in a bottom-up change, and I don't believe in any other way of change. I do believe in a bottom-up change. It is very hard for me to see it influencing state policies or the state in the Lebanese context. And it's very pessimistic of me to say so, but I'm just being honest here. I don't see it happening. Not because we're not good enough, or not because there's not enough people on the streets, or not because we don't deserve it. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that the system, the state is so embedded. The state is so entrenched in how we think, and how we live our lives. I mean, few are the people who are actually desectarianized. Few are the people who actually, they step outside for a minute and they look at the system from an outside perspective, and they're like, oh, it is pretty screwed. Sorry for that. So even the people who did protest, they were, demanding things within the logic of the system.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we want elections, we want early elections, we want a new government. But you're still thinking within the logic of the system. So what are you trying to say? What are you trying to change? What are you trying to reform?
Can I just interrupt you, because I want to just add one more thing. Is this a social pact problem, that the Lebanese are not ready to adopt a new relationship yet with the regime?
I don't know if they're not ready. I don't know if it's a matter of being ready, or it's a matter of knowing. A lot of people, and I see this through my friends, they don't know. They're not curious enough.
This is very interesting for me, and I apologize for keeping you longer than I promised. But this is something I'm really curious about. What exactly do you mean by that? When they say they don't know, is it that they're reluctant to look at other models, or is it that they're still, in a way, living through what our grandparents and great grandparents inherited, which is this communal power sharing, that everyone still has this anxiety?
There is this anxiety, yes, but there's also this political immobilism, which is a product of this power sharing system. Because it is very fixed and very predetermined that the youth, some of the youth and some of society, I'm not going to say all of our society, but some of its members, they don't feel like they are integrated enough to actually have a say. They don't, and this is a personal observation again, that might not be true to others, but my surroundings, at least, the way I see my friends, the way I see how they behave when I talk about politics, because this is all I do when I'm around them.
So do you still have friends, or no? I'm kidding.
actually, they did mention that. They were like, why are we your friends again? Which is totally understandable.
They don't have the answer to that either.
Yeah, and so their disengagement / their political culture is, I would say, not below zero, but it's very average for somebody who should be engaged and who should at least know how to vote, know who they're voting for, know what, the difference between a government and a parliament, like the basic things. I'm talking about the basic things. This really shapes the way the way the state functions. I mean, this kind of helps the state maintain its power again, because the
Yeah.
youth, and because the people are not as interested to know more about how our system work, because because they're not interested to know how change maybe might be possible. This is taken advantage of by the people in power. Yeah,
It's
I
a
don't know.
very, very strange dance between society's expectations and also society's reluctance to.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes, for sure.
And you mentioned many things that I vividly remember on the streets of Beirut. Even the slogan is born out of it. Killon yani killon.
Yeah.
But even that, I don't really know at the end of the day what exactly that translates to. Other than the figures that are visible should all be treated the same. But in terms of structural changes, I don't think that slogan enters that. It's
Yeah.
not overhaul. It's more rein in the leaders that many of us know because we've grown up with them and they've been so visible. Only recently do they try to hide a bit out of maybe some fear, but it's not demanding more than that. And maybe that's where the stumbling block is.
Yeah.
And just a very, I mean, say as much as you'd like about this. And the way you study all of these things and the way you've seen history moving in recent months, are you hopeful that there will be something new emerging anytime soon? Or are you maybe to a degree pessimistic that maybe, and you eloquently described that this is a society has to reform too, and once that happens, maybe then we can expect change. But shy of that, there's no change on the horizon.
Do I see any structural change? I don't think so, even though we are living in a crisis, and like anything can happen in a crisis, you know, and a lot of talks, like I'm hearing a lot of talks on like, civil war and like a war and whatnot, and this reflects really also our, wouldn't say political analysis because that's very like academic, but it reflects the way we understand and the way we perceive politics.
Right.
Because we try to define our present, we try to define our future by referencing what we have lived. That's our only option. Do I see any change? I do see change, obviously, but is it going to be a positive change or a negative change? I really don't know. What I know is that the system is reproducing itself on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And for it to be gone, Heke, is going to be quite challenging. And I don't know if it's realistic if it's, if it's realistic at all, hoping for a change of governance or system. But I can be hopeful, I guess. But in all honesty, I am not pessimistic, but I'm just like, I don't have any particular say on the future of the system, just because I strongly believe that it is still reproducing itself. I mean, yeah.
If anyone watching this from a place that has no relationship to Lebanon, and then they see us, right, talking to each other, they're going to think this is some Finnish podcast or Swedish exercise in history. It's like these two blonde, these very white and blonde.
Yeah.
What are they talking about? Is it Ireland or Denmark? No. Middle East. Yeah, we don't. I don't think we are maybe the most like immediate faces.
Right?
Yeah, maybe we should call National Geographic and take a screenshot of this and just say the Arab, whatever, Lebanon protests. It's like what?
Yeah.
You're very kind with your time. You gave me more than an hour of your time. It's past 11:15 in Beirut. I think you won the argument. The state needs, yeah, absolutely. I think you won. And to be honest, I like playing devil's advocate on this issue because I think it has to be explored. But you won it. You won the argument in a way I think that touches on other issues, which is society is a major issue here, and maybe it's not being addressed the way you need it to be addressed in order to achieve political change. That it's still at the beginning. But if anything, it started, and it's definitely going to be our lifetime. We're going to see, that if it does change, it'll be in the years to come because something fundamentally shifted in modern Lebanese history.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Thank you, and no, I really appreciate this. Thanks for listening, and a friendly reminder to help support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.